Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? This time, we're tackling that Azerbaijan Airlines crash on Christmas Day. We've got a mountain of news reports to sift through, and even some spicy Reddit threads to spice things up a bit.
Yeah, definitely a deep dive. It's a really tangled situation, especially with the whole Russia-Ukraine thing looming in the background.
Absolutely. So to get everyone up to speed, we're talking about more than just a tragic accident here. An Azerbaijan Airlines plane goes down in Russian airspace. 38 people lose their lives, and then Putin issues an apology.
Mhm.
But here's where it gets interesting. He doesn't actually take any responsibility.
Yeah, that apology, it's fascinating, really. On the surface, it seems like, he's trying to smooth things over. But when you look a little closer, Putin very carefully shifts the blame to the whole conflict with Ukraine, saying the plane was essentially caught in the crossfire as Russia defended itself against those Ukrainian drones.
So it's like, sorry, not sorry.
Mhm.
Seems pretty convenient, right?
But hold on, because we've got these reports suggesting a completely different story, that the plane was actually hit by Russian air defense missiles while it was trying to land in Chechnya.
Exactly. And those reports, they really raise some eyebrows. Plus, we have survivors who say they heard loud bangs before the crash. It's pretty chilling. Makes you question the whole official story.
Yeah, it's adding to the confusion, for sure. And then, just to make things even more complicated, U.S. defense officials come out and publicly say they believe Russia is responsible for taking down the plane. So suddenly, it's not just a tragic accident, it's an international incident.
Yeah, exactly. And that really brings up this question of motivations. Why would Putin try to shift blame? It's possible he's trying to protect Russia's image globally, especially with everyone watching what they're doing in Ukraine.
Makes sense. And think about it, if he admits fault, it could lead to problems at home too, like political instability. If people start thinking the military acted recklessly, that could be a big deal. For sure. And then there's the bigger picture, the conflict itself. Russia might not want to escalate things with the West. Maybe they're worried about tougher sanctions or even military intervention, so they're treading carefully.
So we've got Putin potentially playing defense on multiple fronts: international image, internal politics, the balance of power with the West.
Exactly. And each of those could be shaping his actions and the story he's telling.
Huh.
It's like, classic geopolitics.
Yeah.
Reading between the lines.
Right. Speaking of reading between the lines, let's get into some of the technical stuff. There's this theory going around that the plane's GPS systems got messed up by electronic jamming, and then it got hit by shrapnel from Russian air defense missile blasts. So for those of us who aren't pilots, what does GPS jamming even mean for a plane that's in the air? And how reliable is shrapnel analysis in these kinds of situations?
Okay, so imagine you're a pilot, right? You're relying on GPS to navigate. And suddenly your system just goes haywire. You're basically flying blind, which is, super dangerous, especially when you're trying to land. Now, with shrapnel analysis, it can actually be pretty helpful. You can use it to figure out what kind of weapon was used, maybe even the path of the projectile. But it's not always a slam dunk, especially in a chaotic situation like this one.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle, but you're missing some pieces. And just to add another piece to the puzzle, Azerbaijan's transport minister said the plane experienced, quote-unquote, external interference and damage both inside and out.
Right. And that statement kind of backs up the theory that something hit the plane. Whether it was on purpose or an accident is still up in the air.
Okay, so we've got these conflicting reports, political motivations, and technical evidence that doesn't give us a clear picture. So where do we go from here?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. To get to the truth, we need to look beyond just what happened. We need to understand why it happened. We need to see Russia's actions through the lens of the conflict with Ukraine, their past behavior in similar situations, and their overall goals in the region. This whole thing, it reminds me of a few other times when Russia's been accused of similar stuff. Like when that Malaysia Airlines flight got shot down over Ukraine back in 2014, they did a lot back then to kind of deflect blame and muddy the waters,
Yeah.
spreading disinformation, not letting investigators in, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you're right. Those past incidents definitely make this situation even more suspicious. It makes you wonder if there's a pattern here. And if so, what are the chances of actually holding Russia accountable this time?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's really hard to hold a country accountable for something like this, especially when there's so much uncertainty and everyone's saying different things.
It feels like we're in this legal gray area. Was this an act of war? Was it negligence? Criminal negligence? And how do you even prove they did it on purpose when we don't even know exactly what happened?
You've hit the nail on the head. Figuring out intent is a nightmare in these situations. You have to piece together circumstantial evidence, analyze technical data, and Frankly, you need the international community to actually want to do something about it. And even if you can prove intent, then you run into the whole jurisdiction problem. Which court or international body even has the authority to investigate and prosecute something like this?
It's like one of those courtroom dramas where they argue about who gets to try the case. It's like fiction is becoming reality. Except the stakes are way higher here. The consequences for Russia could be huge.
Exactly. And there's also the question of cooperation. Will Russia even play ball with an international investigation? Especially if they think it's biased against them. History tells us they might not. They could use their influence to slow things down or discredit the whole process.
Okay, let's say, just for argument's sake, an investigation does happen, and they find that Russia did intentionally target the plane. What then? What could actually happen to them?
Well, the consequences could be anything from diplomatic slaps on the wrist to more economic sanctions to becoming even more isolated on the world stage. In the worst-case scenario, you could even see military intervention. But each of those options comes with its own set of risks and uncertainties.
Like a giant game of chess where every move has a ripple effect.
Hmm.
And in the middle of all of this are the families of the victims, just looking for justice and answers. Makes you wonder what kind of support they're getting and how they're dealing with this horrible loss.
It's heartbreaking, truly. It shows the human cost of these geopolitical conflicts. And it's a reminder that while we're talking about strategy and legalities, there are real people deeply affected by these events. Their stories deserve to be heard.
For sure. Their stories also highlight why it's so important to understand the bigger picture. You said earlier that Russia might be trying to avoid escalating things with the West. But how could this incident actually affect the balance of power in the region? Things are already pretty tense.
That's the big question. This incident, regardless of what caused it, throws a wrench into things. It adds a whole new level of uncertainty and volatility to the region. Maybe it emboldens Russia, makes them think they can act without consequences. Or maybe it makes them more cautious, afraid of pushing the West too far. It's hard to say.
Sounds like we're in for a bumpy ride then. Lots of tension and unpredictable stuff happening. Never a good thing when you're dealing with countries that have nuclear weapons. What about Azerbaijan? They lost 38 of their people. How do you think they'll handle this incredibly difficult situation?
They're in a tough spot, that's for sure. They have strong ties with both Russia and the West, depend on both for their economy and security. They'll need to walk a fine line, pushing for accountability without jeopardizing those relationships.
You mentioned earlier how Russia has used disinformation in the past. Do you think that's something we should be watching for here?
Absolutely. In this age of social media and information warfare, controlling the narrative is more important than ever. We can expect to see a real battle of narratives playing out. Russia will push their version of events, and Western powers will present a counter-narrative. The challenge will be figuring out what's actually true amidst all the noise.
So it's like we all need to become amateur detectives, constantly checking information, looking for inconsistencies. And speaking of inconsistencies, let's talk about those Reddit reactions we mentioned earlier. People have had a lot to say about this whole situation, remember?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And while you can't take social media commentary as fact, it does give you a glimpse into how people are feeling and interpreting these events.
You know, reading through those threads, it's amazing the range of emotions you see. Anger, confusion, sadness, skepticism. People seem fed up with the lack of transparency, like they're not getting the whole story.
That's a really important point. And that feeling of distrust, it can have real consequences. If people lose faith in institutions and the information they're getting, it's much harder to find common ground and solutions.
Which brings us back to the heart of this whole deep dive, right?
Yeah.
We're trying to find truth and accountability in a world where information is often used as a weapon, and the line between fact and fiction is getting blurrier by the day.
Exactly. As we keep digging into this tangled mess of geopolitics, conflicting stories, and unanswered questions, we need to remember that the search for truth is a marathon, not a sprint. There will be roadblocks and frustrations, but we can't give up on demanding answers and holding those in power responsible.
It's like we're at this fork in the road, and every path leads to who knows where. We've got the immediate fallout from the crash, the investigation, or the lack of one, and then the big picture, how this affects things between countries. Lots to think about.
Yeah, a lot to unpack. And each of those paths has its own challenger and potential outcomes. Let's start with the investigation. Given the politics involved, the chances of a truly independent and transparent investigation, they're slim, to be honest.
So even if there is an investigation, we can't really be sure it'll give us the whole story or hold the right people accountable.
Right. It's very likely that the investigation will be influenced by politics. which means the report could downplay or exaggerate certain things. So it really raises the question, how can we ensure some level of accountability even if the investigation isn't completely impartial?
That's a good question. You talked about sanctions and diplomatic pressure before. Could those actually work in this situation? Especially considering Russia's history of weathering those kinds of measures.
Well, sanctions can have an impact, definitely. But it depends on a few things. How severe are the sanctions? Are other countries willing to participate? And can Russia find ways around them? Because remember, Russia has a history of getting around sanctions. They find other markets for their stuff.
So it's not a sure thing. What about diplomatic pressure? Could that help push for a more open investigation or hold those responsible accountable?
Diplomacy is always important in these situations, but it takes a real team effort from the international community. If big players like the US and the EU are united in their condemnation and demand accountability, that can put a lot of pressure on Russia.
But we've seen it before, right? Geopolitical divisions and competing interests can totally derail those efforts. What happens if there's no clear consensus, as some countries don't want to poke the bear too much?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. And if that happens, it's even harder to get anything meaningful done. This is where public pressure and advocacy from groups like human rights organizations become even more vital.
It makes me think of those David and Goliath stories where everyday people band together to demand justice and challenge the big guys. Inspiring, but also kind of scary.
It can be daunting for sure, but history shows us that public pressure, if it's sustained, can really change things. Look at the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa or the push for environmental regulations. It all started with people speaking out, raising awareness, demanding accountability.
So you're saying that even in a situation as complicated as this one, even when we're dealing with a powerful adversary like Russia, there's still reason for hope and action.
Absolutely. It's easy to feel powerless when these big global events happen, but remember, every voice matters. By staying informed, engaging in critical discussions, and supporting organizations fighting for transparency and justice, we can all contribute to a more accountable and just world.
That's a powerful message to leave our listeners with. It's not about having all the answers or knowing what the future holds. It's about recognizing that we can make a difference. We can shape that future.
Exactly. And even though this deep dive into the Azerbaijan Airlines crash has left us with more questions than answers, it's shown us how important it is to think critically, have informed discussions, and hold those in power accountable.
Well said. And to wrap things up, we'll leave you with this. The search for truth and justice, it's rarely straightforward. It's more like a winding road full of unexpected detours. But by staying involved, asking the tough questions, and demanding accountability, we can navigate that road towards a world that's more just and fair for everyone. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.